You're listening to One Decision, the podcast that looks at the choices that shape our lives. I'm Kasia Madera, a journalist, a broadcaster, and today I'm your guest host.
And I'm Richard Dearlove, former Chief of British Intelligence, otherwise known as MI6.
Each week we explore some of the biggest choices and issues that have global impact. We hear from the key players and influencers making, informing and shaping the decisions that affect us all. And so, Richard, I'm really excited about today's guest, given both of our experiences of life behind the Iron Curtain.
Yeah, she's a seminal figure, an important personality. And yeah, you've lived in Poland. I lived in communist Czechoslovakia. So for us, this has a sort of symbolic importance to exchange and hear the views of someone in this situation.
So, our guest is described as a symbol of hope for Belarus, the Eastern European country that was part of the Soviet Union. Since the collapse of communism, Belarus has spent the past 30 years under the authoritarian rule of President Alexander Lukashenko. Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya was thrown into political activism after her husband, Sergei Tikhanovsky, was arrested when he announced he would stand in Belarus's 2020 presidential election. Sviatlana, you took the decision to take on the role that your husband was prevented from doing. You became the leader of the Belarusian opposition. Describe to us the impact that has had on you.
First of all, thank you for this possibility to tell my story and the story of Belarusian people, nation fighting for democratic changes in Belarus. My story is rather interesting because I was never interested in politics, and when it was my husband actually who only in 2019 started to be involved in politics. He started to communicate. He was a blogger. He started to communicate with Belarusian people, asking them questions, how they feel in Belarus, what are the salaries, what are the incomes, so on and so forth. And he became so popular that people started asking him to run for president. He's really people's hero. And when he declared about his decision to run for president, he was immediately detained. He was imprisoned and he didn't manage to give his documents for registration for presidential election. And as his wife, just out of love to my husband, I decided to run instead of him. I didn't think about consequences. I didn't think about uprising. It was really only to show my husband that what he has done or what he was doing is important for me as well. Then I really discovered myself to be the only opponent to Lukashenko, and I was joined by other democratic delegates, and we ran for campaign for presidency. And according to alternative accounts, I have won elections, but Lukashenko refused to leave power and unleashed the most brutal terror against Belarusians our country has experienced for all the 30 years of Lukashenko's governing. And since then, 4 years, I am, together with other Belarusians, with our brave heroes, are fighting against dictatorship. We are fighting against creeping occupation of our country by Russia. We are trying to help Ukrainian nation in this war. So we have a lot of challenges, but I can't give up. Sometimes I'm frustrated. Sometimes I'm exhausted. I'm bringing up two children. My husband is in jail for 4 years, but I feel a huge responsibility for those people in prisons who sacrificed their freedom. But also I feel responsibility for my country, for future of my children.
Sviatlana, we were all massively inspired by the extent of the sort of demonstrations against the Lukashenko regime in the run-up to that fraudulent election. But looking ahead, how do you think that your country is going to rid itself of this dictator? How do you envisage the political situation evolving, let's say, over the next 3 or 4 years?
I understand that we Belarusian people are not just fighting for our land. There is a fight between democracy and tyranny. It's a fight between past and future for my country. And we are, as Belarusian people, at a crossroad. Either Belarus becomes a free, independent European state or remains in Russian orbit. And in 2020, Belarusians clearly chose freedom and Europe, and now we continue to defend this choice. So I actually don't know how the situation will develop, because so many obstacles that might influence situation in Belarus. It's victory of Ukraine that will be a huge blow on Putin, who is supporting Lukashenko. Hence, Lukashenko will be weakened, and we will be prepared for the moment of opportunity that will be in Belarus. And our task now is to weaken the regime and to strengthen Belarusian people, Belarusian civil society, Belarusian national identity. So many challenges around us. We see how Russia is trying to erase everything Belarusian from Belarus, erase our nation. They want to subjugate our country. Lukashenko is already there. Lukashenko is already in the hands of Putin, but we need to save our nation, to save our country. Of course, I want our fight to be sprint, but it's already a marathon. And we have to be patient, we have to be creative, we have to be innovative in fighting this old style but brutal dictatorship. I think that we have to keep our strength, to weaken the regime, strengthen ourselves, but also to encourage democratic world to be with those who are on the front line of this fight against dictatorship. Because now the dictators are fighting in Ukraine, in Belarus, Europe, but if we don't defeat them now, they will knock your doors of democratic countries. So don't look at a system of the people who are fighting against dictatorship. It's not charity. It's investment into peace and security of the whole Europe, of the whole region, and actually the whole world.
So when you see Western countries, when you see in the States, for example, a whole conversation about potentially not giving aid towards Ukraine, not giving them arms, how on earth does that make you feel? Because I'm assuming that what you're seeing in Belarus is an echo of what we're witnessing in Ukraine as well. A fight against Putin. Of course, Lukashenko is in the hands of Putin. How do Belarusians feel about what is happening in Ukraine?
So, first of all, I have to say that it's evident that Lukashenko serves Russia, not the Belarusian people. Putin supported Lukashenko back in 2020, and Lukashenko pays back with our sovereignty. Piece by piece, he is selling Belarus to Russia, to Putin. And Lukashenko dragged our country into the war, and he's responsible for this. He is the same war criminal as his partner. And here we have to distinguish Belarusian regime, who is part of this war, and Belarusian people who against the war, who are supporting Ukrainians as much as we can. We can't give missiles, and then billions and billions to Ukraine, but we can show our solidarity. When the war had started, Belarusian partisans disrupted railways to slow down Russian equipment going to Ukraine, that was supposed to bomb Kiev or Bucha, Our military volunteers fighting in Ukraine shoulder to shoulder with Ukrainians. Our Belarusian refugees who fled repressions helping Ukrainian refugees, because we know what it means, to grab your child, grab some stuff and leave your country, leaving everything behind, not knowing what is waiting for you in the future. So the fate of Belarus and Ukraine are fully intertwined. Without free Ukraine, no chance for Belarus. But without free Belarus, there will be no safe Ukraine. And of course, we ask to help Ukraine with everything it needs. Freezing conflict will remain Belarus in the hands of Lukashenko and Putin, and we mustn't allow it. Dictators use any weakness, any divisions, any fatigue, they are trying to find any crack that they can use. We don't have right for fatigue. Tell about fatigue to the soldiers in Ukrainian trenches and political prisoners in Belarusian prisons. They can't get tired of resisting, neither should we. If you don't stop Putin now in Belarus and Russia, in Ukraine, he will knock your doors, as I said before. Dictators cannot be appeased. Dictators cannot be re-educated. We deal with organized criminal gang. And I want the West to be more decisive in supporting Ukraine and free Belarus. For 2 years, no strong sanctions were imposed, no punishment for crimes against humanity or deportation of Ukrainian kids, half measures only harm. So how we Belarusians and I think Ukrainians perceive the situation, that one hand is condemning Lukashenko, and Putin, another hand continues dealing and trading with him. So we need international coalition and comprehensive strategy that include dismantling the regime, taking Belarus out of the war and supporting those democratic and European aspirations, but also full support to Ukraine. They need to get everything. They need to defeat this enemy.
Sviatlana, one of the things that worries me, for example, is if you look across Europe, there is still what one might describe as a sort of fifth column of sympathy for Putin. So you've got leaders like Orban, you've got Serbia, even amongst the extreme European right wing, which is going to do rather well in the European elections, you can see echoes of sympathy and support for, I was going to say for Russia, but for Putin. So, I mean, the situation is for us quite complex in terms of, as it were, having a completely united front in dealing with this extraordinary threat which has evolved to Western Europe from Putin's regime. We've had this recent problem in Georgia, too, with the legislation that's been pushed forward about foreign influence, which is copying Russian legislation on the same issue. I mean, it does add a dimension of complexity, which is worrying. Fico in Slovakia as well, although, there was this rather extraordinary assassination attempt on him. I mean, what's your commentary, your advice in this general area?
In the democratic world, I want to believe that everything depends on people. And it's obligation of people in the democratic world not to be poisoned by these populist and propagandistic messages, that it's not your business. Why do you have to sacrifice your comfort life, to help Ukraine? Of course, dictators will use these narratives to frustrate people. It's so easy to think that, it's really not my business. Why should I interfere? It's not my obligation. It's their problems. It's not their problems. It's all our problems. We have to explain to people who enjoy democracy and think that it's given for granted that democracy had to be fought for. And now if we allow, dictators to prevail, believe me, you will be the next targets of these dictators. And dictators, of course, they are so easy making coalitions. They don't have to get any agreement with their people. They decide themselves in personal. And they perceive democracy, democratic world, as very weak world. They don't respect democracy. When they see this undecisiveness or hesitations, they perceive it as weakness. And they testing democratic world, how far they can go in their brutality, just to cause some reaction. They cross red line after red line, just expecting for some answer. No answer, we go further. So tomorrow you can wait them just knocking your doors, as I have already said. So I think that it's people who shouldn't allow this populist to poison their minds. We are waiting for in European Parliament elections, very soon, and elections in the half of the world is taking place. And some populist or isolationist forces, who will win, they might win European Parliament elections, especially some people whose purpose or whose narratives is to let's make deal with Russia or stop putting pressure on Lukashenko. It will be a great mistake to believe to these people. So I call on Europeans to support all those who stand with democracy, with Belarus, with Ukraine. Don't vote for pro-Russian or pro-war politicians. There are no simple solutions, in this situation. And if any politicians say that I will solve Ukrainian issue for 24 hours, believe me, it can't happen, because this crisis is too deep at the moment. And we should always remember that dictators cannot be re-educated. I have very short 4 years, political path. And very often I see that, some politicians want to close the issue, but not to solve the problem. They talk to people as with populistic messages, thinking that they will believe. We have very experienced people, in modern world. We know how to find truth, in this flow of information, how to double check information. So don't think that your people are silly and they can easily believe you.
You touch upon populism, and we've got to touch upon a potentially populist future president in the United States, Donald Trump. Friendship openly discussed with Putin. I guess, and this is for you as well, Sir Richard, because the intelligence agencies must be terrified and worried and concerned about a potential Trump presidency. You say populism is potentially damaging because it enables these dictators such as Lukashenko to rule and thrive, but people are voting for it.
People are voting, because, again, people want to believe in simple solutions. It's much easier to close your eyes, close your ears. I don't see anything, don't want to hear anything. I want to live my comfort life. And person who is promising me this comfort life, it's easier to vote for this person. And then, I don't know, blame him that something, is unsuccessful, or I don't know, but not to look deeper into personality. Do I really want, let's take our region, Russia to invade Ukraine? Do I really want to betray the values democracy is based on? I want cheaper prices. I don't want problems in my life and all this wars influence my comfort. But we don't have to be such material. We have to think about something bigger, that like personal comfort. Because I think that I know what I'm talking about. Because when you live under dictatorship, you start to cherish what you gain, because you people are sacrificing their freedom in Belarusian prisons. People are sacrificing their lives on Ukrainian soil for values you're enjoying every day. So we are thinking a little bit higher than you, but it's also your world, and you want peace in the world. But if you are not contributing to this peace and stability, so believe me, it's very shaken, it's very unstable, and democracy might lose if not your personal involvement. It's so easy to think they will decide. I don't care, let them decide. In our country, our people for 30 years didn't want to decide, because it was like social contract. Lukashenko gives people small salaries, and people don't interfere into politics. It was like, politicians know better, let them decide. We don't want to participate in politics. And we see 30 years of dictatorship. So it's easy. It's very short step from democracy to dictatorship if people stop to be involved in things and think critically.
I'm just going to add on your comment, Kasia. Trump's a risk, he's not a fact yet. So that's the first point. The second point is, I think his chances of being elected have diminished since being found guilty as a felon. And there are indications in polling that a lot of Americans are now questioning him as a future president. And the third point, I would say, even if he is elected, and we mustn't discount that possibility, his unpredictability is still a major factor in Trump policy. We don't actually know what he's going to do. And I'm slightly encouraged by the fact that eventually, this subvention of 60 million did go through to Ukraine, which he didn't stop. And in fact, you could argue that he said something to support it. He's actually said some quite positive comments recently about NATO. So it's possible that his ground is shifting. I'm not being complacent about this. I just don't think we should sit there making this assumption that, the world's going to go to hell in a handcart because Trump's going to be elected. It hasn't happened yet, and I don't think it's necessarily going to happen. Let's just say that at the moment. Difficult to predict. But I agree entirely with what Sviatlana is saying about, the attitude of people. They can't sort of close their eyes. People must go out and vote and understand the risk and the dangers which have arisen around us.
Yeah, if I may add to so possible Trump's election, because we here in Belarus and Ukraine, we are terrorized with these narratives that if Trump comes, all the support will be restricted. But I want to say that I hope that there will be people in his team who understand the importance of Ukraine and Belarus and counter Russia. Democracy, and the hearsay is democracy. It's not about one person. It's about people, who are around, and I think that even if there will be some intention to have some deal with Putin, again, these are narratives we hear here, democratic system will not allow this to happen.
So you think that people who potentially say that there has to be some kind of negotiation between Volodymyr Zelensky and Putin, it just can't happen, it shouldn't happen?
Look, all the wars, in the world has ended with negotiations. But on these negotiations will be on the terms of, on the conditions of Ukraine. No one piece of land has to be given to invader. No one concessions, have to be made. Is the question who is the stronger? Ukraine with all the democratic allies, around, or Russia, who will be in the strongest position? And I'm sure that Ukraine has to have the strongest positions ever. But also, again, I'm representing Belarus here. Don't forget about Belarus. Don't let, during these possible negotiations, to leave Belarus as consolation prize for Putin. Because this is what Belarusian people are asking me. If there are negotiations, don't you think that Belarus will be betrayed? That because it's such a perception at the moment that everything is concentrated on Ukraine. We fully support this, but Belarus is overlooked. Belarus is not perceived as part of the solution, of our region. Believe me, without free Belarus, independent Belarus, there will be no peace and security in the region. There will be constant threat to our European neighbors and also to Ukraine. So don't leave Belarusian nation one-to-one with imperialistic ambitions of Russia.
How do you change that, though? Because you've got elections in Belarus next year in 2025. I'm assuming you can't stand in them. You can't enter into the country. You'll be arrested immediately. You'll end up in prison like your husband. What do you do? It will be another rigged election.
What you call elections, it has nothing in common with elections in Belarus. Of course, it will not be real elections. The so-called elections will resemble a military operation. No alternative candidates will be registered. All potential leaders are either in prison or in exile. All free media are ruined. All the civil society is liquidated, frightened. It will be like circus. It will be Soviet-style ritual. It will be process of appointing of Lukashenko by Lukashenko. It will not change anything for our country. The solution for Belarus is only free and fair elections. And while Lukashenko is there, we can't talk about free and fair elections. So, of course, I will not be able to participate. And actually, if we look broad on the picture, Lukashenko doesn't have right to hold any elections because he lost his mandate, in 2020. He refused to go. He suppressed people, but he's not legitimate person, legitimate ruler, and the democratic world doesn't recognize him as legitimate. I want to believe actually the democratic world will hold consistent policy towards Lukashenko. That after so-called elections, after this process in 2025, they will not say, okay, elections took place, so we start to recognize Lukashenko again. Of course, they will not do this, and they recognize legitimacy of democratic forces, agency of democratic forces. So it will not change a lot. Of course, we will use this campaign, or we will use this event, for anti-Lukashenko campaign. Maybe there will be acts of sabotage or some rallies or some media campaigns. I don't know how we'll use all our potential, but for sure, these so-called elections will not change for our country and for Belarusians.
Sviatlana, there's a theory in the West that, a humiliated and defeated Russia actually becomes a much more dangerous entity as far as European security is concerned, unless the Russian people themselves, solve the problem of an autocrat like Putin, and we see no evidence of that at the moment. So in a way, we are faced with a dilemma, because you could argue that a compromise, which I certainly don't support, leaves Russia in a position where it becomes more accommodating. But on the other hand, we want to see Russia driven out of the territories that it invaded and took over, and Ukraine restore its sort of territorial integrity. But there is a problem here, because, the lesson of World War I, a humiliated and defeated Germany, became, the major problem of the middle of the 20th century. And, one can envisage, I'm not drawing a direct historical parallel, but there is a real problem here. What are your feelings about that? Because, you in Belarus are living, closer to the problem, more intimately than anybody else.
I fully agree with statement that fight against dictatorship, or dictator, it's obligation, in my case, of Belarusian people. We are not asking democratic world to fight instead of us. It's our duty. But we need support. We can't do it alone. No one war, no one fight in the world was won without allies. We need energy to continue this fight. We need assistance to build structures, to strengthen our media. We need solidarity. I'm talking about Belarus at the moment. We want to be part of European family of countries. Show us perspective. Don't push our nation, our people to Russian hands. Open your doors for us. And honestly speaking, I can't say on behalf of the Russians, it's also their obligation to fight for their country. If now there are more pro-war people or anti-Ukrainian people, the changes maybe will take long times. But in Belarus, I see the changes very close. But we need some push, some pressure on the regime. We can't restrict Lukashenko economically. We can't empty his personal pockets. But you can help us to do this. Help us to deprive him of resources to punish people, to detain people, torture people. Stop him from helping Russia in this war. He made Belarus a military base, like assembly shop for Russia. Why still, this trade is taking place? Help us to strengthen ourselves. Like Belarusian people who are fighting for 4 years already in a row. It's very difficult. We have a lot of challenges. We need to charge our battery every day with small positive messages, with small decisions, pro-Belarusian decisions or anti-Lukashenko decisions. We recharge our battery and we can keep strong. So be with us, show our perspectives, show alternative to Ruski Mir. I have to say that, for the first time, for 30 years of Lukashenko's governing, more Belarusian students went to study to Russian universities than to European. It's not because they're choosing Russian world, but because borders are closed, visas are not given to Belarusian people, less scholarships for Belarusians, because some countries, some politicians are still putting Belarusians and Russian into one basket, after the beginning of the war. So don't do this. Welcome Belarusians. To feel democracy and to learn democracy, we have to breathe this free air. We have to understand, how free society is working. We have to study in European universities, not to be poisoned by Russian narratives in Russian universities. We need to see our relatives. We need to strengthen people-to-people ties. Lukashenko is already in the hands of Putin. We have to isolate him because we will not be able to re-educate him, but save people, help us to be more European, more pro-democratic.
Do you feel that there's an underestimation in the West about what Lukashenko is doing, that he's simply a puppet of Putin, therefore he can be disregarded? I think there was an element of the West only really realizing just how strong he is when we saw that weaponization of migrants, when he was giving visas to people from the Middle East, bringing them to Minsk, busing them to the borders with Poland. And we saw that awful situation with people dying on the Belarusian-Polish border. Has the West just disregarded and not really understood what is happening in Belarus?
We are working hard, to rediscover Belarus to the world. For many, many years, it was perceived as appendix, a satellite of Russia, and nobody never perceived it as unique, separate nation. And it's because of policy of Lukashenko. Belarusian voice wasn't heard. And now, we as democratic forces, we are strong enough and we are supported by the democratic world, and we can explain Belarusian situation. And of course, we explained that Lukashenko is puppet of Putin, that Lukashenko and Putin have symbolic relationship. Like they might hate each other, but they need each other. For Putin, Lukashenko is the possibility to control Belarus and use it for military purposes. For Lukashenko, Putin is the guarantee to stay in power. So we must see and treat them as one. Meanwhile, we must separate the regime and people, because people of Belarus, they don't want war, they don't want Russia. Belarusians fight for their freedom, same as Ukrainians fight for their country against Russian aggression. So, and Russia, of course, they perceived Belarus and Ukraine as naughty children that decided to go into the separate future. And Russia, no, you have to be with me. I don't let you go. What right do you have? Not allow countries to choose their future by themselves. They want to restore the Soviet empire. We don't want this. We European nations, we want to return to our real family of countries. But of course, Lukashenko has to be treated the same as Putin. And that's why we trying to persuade our international justice systems to launch special investigations against Lukashenko for his crimes against humanity, dragging our country into the war, hijacking of airplane, orchestrating of migration crisis, of course, for abduction of Ukrainian children. And this is, again, undecisiveness or lack of political will of the democratic world, why this investigation hasn't started. You have all the tools. It's, again, about how people who are fighting for democracy perceive you. So, we shouldn't allow dictators to feel impunity for their actions, and they're criminals.
Sviatlana, is there a significant partisan problem in Belarus at the moment? I mean, in support of Ukraine? I mean, we know that Lukashenko has raised a battalion or a military unit of volunteers to fight with Russia. But is the opposite thing happening? Are there, significant groups who are operating? I mean, I'm not asking you to reveal anything sensitive. I mean, just a general comment as to whether this sort of actual military opposition or, let's say, partisan opposition exists at the moment.
So in Belarus, we have underground partisans who disrupted railways when the war has started. Then there were some acts of sabotage. Some our partisans blew very expensive Russian surveillance airplane in Minsk airport without victims. So we have small groups inside the country. They can't act now, and there is no necessity to act now because it's not proper moment. But on the Ukrainian side, there are hundreds of Belarusian military volunteers who are fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainians, who are sharing the same trenches with them. Belarusian regiment is the biggest international regiment that is fighting in Ukraine, because we understand that fighting for Ukraine, we are fighting for Belarus as well. So it's our obligation also to help Ukraine as much as we can. We can't do a lot, but we do what we can.
Everything that you're doing is coming at a huge personal cost. When we first met at the Warsaw Security Forum a couple of years ago, you said you were a housewife who's been put in this situation. How is your husband doing? Because I know you hear often some of the worst rumors about his condition. Do you have any contact with him at all?
Of course, my husband is my personal pain, and I'm waking up and going to bed with the thoughts precisely about him. But we have thousands of my husbands in Belarusian prisons. You have thousands of men and women and minors, and you experiencing this full pain for these people. Thousands of separated families, of broken families, thousands of children like mine who haven't seen for their daddies or mothers for years. As for me personally, we have to learn new words for us, incommunicado mode. It's a type of torturing people. It means that people are held in full isolation. I haven't heard about my husband since March 2023, more than 1 year. Nothing at all. I don't know if he's alive. I don't know in what health condition he is. He doesn't, we writing letters to him, we never got any answers. So I don't know anything. I think that with this incommunicado mode, of course, it's like, it's huge burden on us. We like constantly thinking about our beloved. But I think that the aim of this incommunicado mode is to ruin people inside the country, to make them believe that they are abandoned, that nobody is taking care. Look, lawyer is not allowed to visit you, like lawyer is not coming, no letters from anybody. People forgot about you. Your sacrifice was in vain. You made mistake. And I want to believe that our friends, our relatives, our beloved in jails, they know that we continue to fight. They know that we are not giving up because, they sacrifice matter. They sacrifice give us strength to continue to fight. For example, I transform my pain and my anger of the situation to energy to continue this fight because, I have no other choice. I see, my children asking me every day, where's our daddy when we are going to see him. They know that he's in jail and they know that their daddy is hero, but they don't feel him, and I want normal childhood for my children with daddy in normal country. And I know that other Belarusians also not giving up for these reasons, not only now for our personal comfort, but for some higher purposes, for independence, for sovereignty, for democracy. Of course, sometimes I'm exhausted. Of course, I'm frustrated. Of course, when I see that the instruments the democratic world has is not fulfilled in full, when I see some hesitation or undecisiveness, of course, it's like frustrating me. I have rather short, I said already, 4 years career, and it was very unexpected, and I immediately started to meet with many politicians, with prime ministers, because everything was so unnatural for me. But what is the most painful for me during all these visits and meetings was to see emptiness in the eyes of politicians, to understand that this particular person somehow can help, can energize my people, maybe can release 1 or 2 political prisoners, but he or she is not interested because it's not my business. This is the most painful, but I still believe, in democracy. I believe in people. I know that better people who are on the good side of this world, it's much more such people. I'm trying to encourage Belarusians also not to give up. It's also easy to give up when you're constantly in pain, in constant challenges, legalization, like no visas, no seeing relatives, this war. It's again about obligation. It's again about responsibility. If not you, who then? So you 1 drop, he 1 drop, but we are sea and we are ocean. I'm learning how to talk to people and to politicians and to the highest persons. But I also need energy and understanding that we are not alone, that many democratic countries are trying to help us to strengthen our national identity, understand our pain, our problems, and of course understand Ukraine. It gives me energy to continue. I know that I'm not abandoned, I'm not forgotten, and Belarus is on agenda.
Sviatlana, can I say that I'm sure that the listeners to this podcast will share our impression of your courage, your commitment, your humanity, and your leadership. You are inspirational.
Thank you. Thank you for attention to our country.
Sviatlana, thank you so much for talking to us. Thank you. Thank you for your time. It is inspirational to hear how much optimism Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya has and how high expectations she has for the West to get involved, to do something.
Absolutely agree. I think the West has a massive responsibility to respond to her message and to take clear note of what she's saying. She is not intimidated, and she understands the fundamental problem which her country is facing. But of course, she is projecting that in a more general sense and saying, if you don't stand behind us and stand behind Ukraine and deal with this problem, the cards are going to fall over in other countries or going to be pushed over by these dictators. So it's extraordinary. And I must say, to hear someone who 4 or 5 years ago was a mother and a school teacher, her development, her passage into politics and into this extraordinary position of danger, exposure. I mean, she's facing the most difficult task, but her message is clear. It's positive, and it's not expressed with any doubt. Her convictions are overwhelming. I must say, she is inspirational.
Yes, really. And that just the way she emphasizes that Lukashenko is not the Belarusian people. It's really important to remember that going forward.
Well, I think the fate of Belarus, we've all been so worried about the war in Ukraine, about the Russians opening a new front. You sort of neglect this aspect of the problem. And one, I wouldn't say is forgotten, but one's just pushing aside that whole business of the pre-presidential demonstrations and the way that people came out on the streets. And then that was very much suppressed with Russian assistance and help. It's an incredible passage. But of course, she's quite right. Belarus has its own identity. It has its own problems. And, we need to factor that into our consideration of this Central European crisis, which is what it is.
Well, on that note, that is it for this week's episode of One Decision. We drop new episodes every Thursday. Do like and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Drop us a line as well. Tell us your thoughts, what decisions have impacted you where you live. You can write to us. Our email is onedecision@onedecisionpodcast.com. From me, from Sir Richard and the team, thank you so much for listening. See you next time.